Welcome to What the Flick, everybody. Ben Mankiewicz, Matt Atchley, Alonzo Duralde, Christy Lemire, Christopher Lee, dead today at 93. And even though, you know, and I've done his movies at TCM, introduced them, I still reading his obit today. It's stunning to realize that only 15 of his movies were horror movies.
Wow.
Because he's always a villain.
Right, he's a villain, and he's sort of just so identified with those horror movies, but only 15. That's amazing.
What is your favorite of his his classic ones? His Dracula?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that. I think he did 8 of those. He did a significant number of them. Yeah, I mean, he's good in all of them. He's good. You know, I mean, I think of him. I mean, I think many. I still. The Lord of the Rings roles were so, even though I didn't love those movies, but they made such an impact. That's still what I think of him first. But also, he was the villain in, actually where I think of him first is the villain in Man with Golden Gun.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right, and he was up for a role in Dr. No. He was actually up for that because he's a cousin to Ian Fleming.
Ian Fleming wanted him for Dr. No.
I didn't know that. To me, in our house, he's Count Dooku.
Right.
So we had a whole long conversation today about Count Dooku and how, wow, Count Dooku was a Jedi, and then he went to the dark side. And, you know, at first he trained Qui-Gon, who trained Obi-Wan, who trained Anakin. So to me, he's Count Dooku. So we had a whole long talk about various colors of lightsaber in our house today. But it's cool, though, that, yes, you think of him as a villain, but no matter what movie he's in, like, when you see him, you know he's going to be a badass. Like, you know he's going to be a formidable force, whatever kind of film it is. The wide range over how many years? Like 70 years? He was 93 years old. There was no like one note Christopher Lee role, and no matter how ridiculous the film was. I mean, like the Lord of the Rings movies. Sorry, guys, they're kind of ridiculous.
Well, the Hobbit movies.
The Hobbit movies are ridiculous,
right?
But he always took it so seriously and brought gravitas.
And that made a big difference.
It does.
Right, he was an actor that would bring authority and almost legitimacy to any cockamamie movie he'd be in, right? And like a lot of guys who've been around for that long, there are movies in his filmography that you look at and you're like, oh, come on, man, you're better than this. Christopher Plummer, same way, right?
Right.
But he's a guy that brings a certain amount, like, oh, Christopher Lee's in this? I have to take this at least halfway seriously.
And I think, you know, thankfully, and it's unlike, say, his predecessors, Dracula, Bela Lugosi, who never quite shook off that mantle and found other films that were really, you know, up to his speed. You know, Lee got to do so many great movies over such a long period of time. I mean, The Wicker Man, and you know, I'm a big fan of Gremlins 2: The New Batch. You know,
Dumb movies that he
that's
took
a brilliant
seriously.
movie, and he's great in it.
Lugosi had to play Dracula at parties. Like he would come in the outfit. He didn't want to, but that was the only way he could work. And Lee has this amazing, I mean, he'd already had a late career renaissance, but then he had an extra late career renaissance. And interestingly, I just read
a metal career.
And this heavy metal career.
And he wrote an amazing memoir too.
Revered among heavy metal fans, Christopher Lee is. And a couple of them I work with in Atlanta, and they're like, they love Christopher Lee. But interesting, I was just reading that he was, I was reminded of something that's not in this obit, but one thing that is in this obit is his hosting Saturday Night Live, and he was asked to play Dracula.
Oh, yeah.
He wouldn't do it.
Interesting.
Like that's the most anti-Lugosi thing you could do, is be like, no, I'm not doing it, man. I ain't playing Dracula.
Right, Lugosi would have shown up on SNL and been in the costume for every sketch, whether or not he was written as Dracula.
Totally. Like, that's funny, by the way.
Right.
Dracula would have been in every sketch, yeah.
Nixon, why are you wearing that cape?
Sorry, that's Bob and Angie. That's Dracula. He lives down the block. So, but
It's gonna happen this week
When I
now,
remember one of my, I hope it's Christopher Lee. I really think it is Christopher Lee. But so he's hosting Saturday Night Live in I don't know when. It
was first cast. I remember like there's a sketch with
late
Lorraine
70s.
Newman and stuff.
I feel like late 70s. There's the sketch with Lorraine Newman, right, where and her dog. And so in the late 70s, and the musical guest, one of the times he was on at least, was Meatloaf. Right? And for this guy who then later becomes this heavy metal legend, so I really hope this is Christopher Lee. So he says, the first time he introduces it, you know, when they come back from the commercial break, and he says, ladies and gentlemen,
I would like you to meet Loaf.
and then sheepishly, the second time he introduced him, was like, ladies and gentlemen, Meatloaf. I've been informed. Yeah.
Right. So Christopher Lee.
Huge loss.
Yes, one of the legends.
Great, real significant contribution.